The lights in the studio didn't flicker. They beamed with an almost surgical sharpness, stripping the room of anything that might hide. Nothing soft survived under those lights. No shadows, no excuses, no illusions. The glass table in the center reflected each panelist like a mirrored stage, exposing even the stillness in their hands. Everything was seen, everything was heard, everything was waiting. Jasmine Crockett sat in the chair furthest from the host, but closest to the line no one wanted to cross. Her blazer was crimson, like blood that knew how to dry dignified. She didn't fidget. Her hands were still, her posture deliberate. She wasn't just present, she was anchored. Her silence wasn't empty, it was coiled. Every inch of her presence said, "I'm ready." Senator J.D. Vance, across the table, wore navy, the color of old power. His tie was tucked just right, hands folded as though they might bless or dismiss the entire conversation. His eyes didn't move much, but when they did, they lingered long enough to remind you he was weighing everything, including people. Especially people. The topic was economic recovery in low-income communities. But the subtext was more loaded than the segment producers could script. Jasmine knew the setup. She had seen it before, lived it before, debates disguised as dialogue, statistics used as shields, and words like logic weaponized against anyone who dared to speak from memory rather than models. The countdown clicked in the host's ear. We're live in 5, 4. Cameras glided into position. Monitors flicked from black to broadcast. And the host smiled a smile he had likely practiced in mirrors, in elevators, in the lingering seconds before guests arrived. Warm but tight. Casual but ready. "Good morning," he began, his voice dripping with authority polished by ratings. "Today, we're asking, how do we bring real recovery to the communities that need it most? What's working, what's failing, and who's being forgotten?" J.D. Vance leaned forward immediately. "Let's be honest," he said, "the way people do when they're about to be anything but. We've thrown billions at these communities, into failing schools, broken welfare systems, and what do we have to show for it? Crime, dependency, more division." Jasmine didn't move. She'd heard this before. This wasn't new. This wasn't even clever. It was familiar, like a tune you don't like but can't forget. The kind of rhetoric that wrapped cruelty in facts and called it common sense. She let him speak. She let the air fill with his confidence, the kind that only comes from never having to ask if your voice belongs in the room. Beside him, a tech CEO nodded along, adding polite corporate jargon about partnerships and innovation. No one listened to him. Not really. The current was pulling somewhere else. Jasmine's presence grew heavier by the second. Not in volume, but in density. She hadn't spoken yet, but the room was already bending toward her. The way forests lean toward storms. In the control room, a producer whispered to another, "She's gonna speak soon." And she did. "If by failing schools," she said, voice even, "you mean schools that have been underfunded, understaffed, and ignored by every state budget for decades, then yes, let's throw every dollar we have at them. Because what you're calling failure is actually theft. Decades of it." Her words didn't rise. They dropped, precise, weighted, deliberate. She didn't need to shout. The studio had gone still. Even the cameras seemed to listen differently now. "You call it a handout," she continued, looking not just at J.D., but through him. "But what you really mean is, if it doesn't look like your neighborhood, it doesn't deserve investment. That's not policy. That's prejudice dressed in a blazer." J.D. leaned back, then forward again, lips parting in what looked like patience but felt like something sharper. "And then," he said it, "you're just being ghetto. Soft. Almost lazy. 4 words. No venom in the tone, no harshness in the pitch. Just a surgical slice, dipped in condescension and coated in centuries of context." The room froze. The host blinked twice, like the words hadn't quite landed. The CEO looked at his hands. One camera operator looked away from his lens, eyes wide. In the control room, no one breathed. Jasmine sat still, for half a beat longer than necessary. Then another. As if she were giving the word time to echo, to ring out and wrap around every microphone, every earpiece, every jaw that had gone slack. She didn't flinch, she didn't blink, she breathed in, once, and adjusted her mic with a small, nearly imperceptible click. Then she looked straight into the camera. Not at J.D., not at the host. Straight into the lens, and through it, into the living rooms and smartphones and brunch tables of a watching nation. "I'm not surprised you said that," she began, her voice a thread of steel. "Because when black women speak with conviction, we're not called assertive. We're called aggressive, we're called angry, we're called ghetto." Her tone didn't change, but the air in the room did. Something shifted, a veil tore. "You hear ghetto," she continued, "and you think insult. I hear South Dallas. I hear resilience. I hear a mother who worked 2 jobs, raised 3 kids, and still made every PTA meeting. I hear pride. I hear survival. I hear home." J.D.'s expression wavered, just slightly. He reached for a rebuttal, but none came. The host opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because nothing could be said after that. The clip lasted 36 seconds. It hit Twitter within 10 minutes. TikTok in 20. Instagram Reels. Reddit threads. It was looped, captioned, dissected, and framed. "She ate. No crumbs," read one comment. "This is power," read another. And somewhere, far from the studio lights, in a modest apartment in Houston, a mother rewound the clip and called her daughter over. "Watch this," she said. "This is how you answer without yelling." But this wasn't the first time Jasmine had been called that word. And it wasn't the first time she had chosen not to let it define her. It began, in truth, years ago, on a Tuesday. In a 4th grade classroom, with a substitute teacher and a worksheet that said racism was over. And Jasmine, then just Jazz, had raised her hand. "Miss Carter," she had said, pointing at the line. "That's not true." The classroom had gone quiet, the way it always did when truth made people nervous. Miss Carter had smiled a small, tight smile. "Well," she said, "aren't you just a little firecracker today?" Then, under her breath, but not quietly enough, "So ghetto fabulous." The other kids didn't laugh. They just looked away. Jazz hadn't cried. Not then. Not when the teacher handed back her worksheet with a sticker. Not when she sat in silence through lunch. But that night, at home, she had told her mother. And Marlene Crockett, strong and steady, had listened, then said something Jazz would never forget. "Next time, finish your point. Say it louder." And she had. She had joined debate club. Not because she liked arguing, but because she was tired of being talked over. She was tired of watching adults confuse volume with victory. She didn't want to be loud. She wanted to be undeniable. It wasn't the beginning of a career. It was the beginning of a decision. To be seen, to be heard, and never to shrink again. By the time Jasmine was 14, her voice no longer asked permission. It arrived, steady, sure, sharpened. Debate club had become her proving ground, not for accolades but for understanding. She didn't care for trophies. What mattered was the way people sat up when she spoke. How silence followed her closing arguments, not applause, just the hush of comprehension. That was her win. Every time her opponent sat still, blinking, not because they were embarrassed, but because they finally got it, that was her currency. Her mother noticed it first. "You don't argue like other kids," Marlene said one night over dinner. "You argue like you're trying to build something out of what you break." Jazz smiled but didn't answer. She didn't need to. At school, she was both admired and avoided. Teachers who praised her essays bristled when she asked for footnotes. Students loved her confidence, until it turned toward their inconsistencies. She walked the halls with a quiet awareness, scanning for nuance the way other teens scanned for Wi-Fi. And she was always listening. To the way people talked about her neighborhood like it was an apology. To the way adults dropped their tone when they said, "Well, Jasmine is different," as though being articulate somehow exiled her from the place that raised her. But she wasn't different. She was South Dallas distilled. Every cracked sidewalk, every front porch sermon, every tired sigh from a mother carrying 2 grocery bags and not a single regret. At Prairie View A&M, she found air again. The kind that didn't shrink her. The kind that didn't ask her to code switch every third sentence. She still stood out, but this time for the right reasons. In student government meetings, she asked the questions others only whispered after. Why did the library close early in the dorms that needed it most? Why were scholarships going to the same 5 departments every year? She didn't yell. She didn't whine. She cited policy and made people listen. Her junior year, at a town hall with local officials, she stood in front of a microphone in a church basement lit by flickering fluorescents and asked a county commissioner a question that made his face freeze mid-smile. How do you explain funding 4 new liquor licenses this year, she asked, in a district with no new grocery stores? The crowd murmured. The commissioner chuckled. You're passionate, he said, patronizing. No, she replied, her voice even. I'm prepared. That moment rippled. By the time she graduated, she wasn't just known. She was sought. Students who'd been dismissed brought her their grievances. Adjunct professors asked her to read over letters they were afraid to send. Custodians who'd worked 30 years without acknowledgement would pause her in the hallway just to say, "Thank you for saying what we can't." She didn't relish the attention. She didn't seek the spotlight. But she carried the weight of it with both hands. After graduation, she went to law school because she wanted to learn how power spoke on paper. Not to mimic it, to master it. In law school, she wore the same blazer until it faded, memorized case law until her eyelids twitched with Latin, and never, not once, let anyone call her angry without demanding they define the word. When she finished, she turned down firm interviews with tall glass buildings and bland mission statements. Instead, she drove to Shreveport and walked into the public defender's office like it was her calling. It wasn't fancy. The AC groaned. The chairs creaked. The mini fridge smelled of betrayal. But the stories there were real. Her first client was 19. Caught with less than a gram. He'd been sitting in jail 2 weeks because bail was $400. He didn't even know how the hearing worked. No one had explained. He looked at Jasmine like she was hope in human form. She never forgot that look. She saw it again and again. In the waiting room every Monday morning, mothers gripping toddlers, teenagers bouncing knees, elders holding plastic bags of papers no one had read. They weren't criminals. They were abandoned, caught in a system that didn't so much break them as ignore them into ruin. And Jasmine? She didn't just defend. She witnessed. She studied the way the judge's tone changed when she spoke. She tracked the difference in how prosecutors interrupted her versus her white colleagues. She noted the way bailiffs looked through her, past her, until she dropped a citation so precise they blinked. She wore her tired like armor. 3 days a week, she skipped lunch. 2 nights a week, she cried in the bathroom after cases where the system won not because it was right, but because it was bigger. Still, she stayed, because she knew her presence wasn't a favor to the courtroom. It was a disruption, and slowly, she learned how to be both invisible and undeniable at once. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal hearing, Jasmine stepped outside into the heat, heels clicking against the pavement, briefcase swinging low. Her stomach churned, not from nerves, but from hunger and something else she didn't name yet. She reached her car, unlocked it, and that's when the cruiser pulled up behind her. 2 cops stepped out, hands relaxed, but not loose. "Ma'am," one said, "is this your vehicle?" She blinked. "I just came from court," she replied, nodding toward the courthouse. "I'm an attorney. Mind showing some ID?" She didn't argue. She moved slowly, deliberately, produced her bar card, her license, her hands never shaking. The officer looked once, then twice, then handed them back. "Be safe out there," he said, as if he hadn't just made a statement with no punctuation. They drove off. She stood still, keys in hand, watching their taillights disappear like truth on a foggy day. Then she laughed, not with joy, but with clarity, because it was never about the degrees, or the wins, or the careful tone. Respectability, she realized, did not protect you. It camouflaged you just enough to be hunted slowly. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the hum of the fridge behind her, and wrote 3 words in the center of a legal pad. Write the rules, and she circled them twice, because something had to change. And maybe it started not with argument but with authorship. Then George Floyd died, and everything shifted. Jasmine watched the video in the dark, her living room lit only by the blue light of injustice looping on a screen too small to hold it. She didn't speak, she couldn't, but she moved. She walked into the streets of Dallas the next morning. Not with a sign, not with a speech, just her body, her breath, her name, and joined the chorus. The chants were familiar, so were the sirens. But what broke her was the third night, when the police boxed the protesters in Lamar Street. No exits, no warnings, just gas, just batons, just screams. She saw a teenager shoved so hard his glasses split down the bridge of his nose. A woman cuffed for standing still. A college student's wrist swelling purple from plastic restraints. And she did not run. She followed them to the station, filed paperwork until 4 a.m., texted every contact she had, got them out, then did it again the next night. Word spread. Call Jasmine. She'll show up. She wasn't the only lawyer helping, but she was relentless, because it wasn't just about arrests. It was about the system, the ordinances, the budget allocations, the legal loopholes that made protest into punishment. She started mapping the money. Who funded the tear gas? Who lobbied for the curfews? Who stayed silent and where they sat on city council? And one question kept returning. What if I stopped reacting and started writing? When the knock came, it was a Tuesday night. She was microwaving leftover rice, phone lighting up with texts from a client. 3 organizers stood at her door. We think you should run, one said, plain. Jasmine blinked. Run where? City council. She laughed. Y'all are serious? We are. She looked down, still holding her fork, still barefoot, still tired. No, she said, but they stayed. For an hour. They talked about what it meant to be the first face people thought of when things broke. About how rare it was to trust someone who didn't just speak, but listened. And before they left, the youngest of them looked her in the eye and said, "You already lead. You just don't call it that yet." That night, Jasmine sat with herself. No speeches, no phone, no armor, and asked, what if? What if she stopped trying to fix the cracks and instead built new walls? What if the courtroom wasn't the end, but the beginning? She didn't sleep much, but by morning she made the call. I'm in, she said. But I'm not changing who I am. And that was enough. There was no ribbon cutting, no press conference, just a folding table in the back of a church whose carpet still smelled faintly of communion wafers and old coffee. The lights flickered, the air buzzed with dust and old hymns. But it was enough. Jasmine didn't launch her campaign so much as unfold it. Like something buried under 1,000, not yets, and maybes, and you should think twice. She didn't have donors. She had determination. She didn't have consultants. She had volunteers, barbers, teachers, ex-clients, grandmothers with clipboards and aching knees. They printed flyers on home printers, used grocery bags as walk kits, wrote slogans in Sharpie and hope. The campaign logo was designed by a high school senior who said, "I don't charge for what I believe in." They knocked doors, hundreds, in the heat, in the rain, in the neighborhoods where no politician had bothered to tread since the last census. Jasmine knocked too, wore out the soles of 2 pairs of flats, lost 5 pounds from walking, gained 1,000 stories from porches and stoops and apartment lobbies that smelled like boiled cabbage and survival. She didn't lead with policy. She led with questions. What's the one thing nobody's fixed? She heard everything. A pothole that broke 3 axles this month. A food bank that turned away people without photo ID. A school that turned off the AC to save money and let the kids sweat through their math tests. She wrote it all down. And never once promised miracles. Just that she would show up. People started to believe her. Not because of commercials, but because of how she looked them in the eye and didn't flinch. In a grocery store parking lot, a woman stopped her and pressed a wrinkled envelope into her palm. "It's from my grocery budget," she whispered. "Don't forget us." Inside, a $5 bill and a note that said, "For someone who looks like me." Jasmine cried that night, not from exhaustion, but from understanding. She was being handed not just money, but memory, trust, pain, hope, all folded into a bill and a few trembling words. Election day came. The lines were long, the faces familiar. She stood outside polling places until her voice rasped, until the skin between her fingers burned from shaking hands. And when the count came in, just before midnight, it was close. Too close. Then, not close at all. She had won, not by a landslide but by a shift. A turn, a breath of air through a long-closed window. Her victory speech wasn't a speech. It was a microphone that barely worked, a crowd that wept, and a single sentence that said everything. We didn't just win a seat. We proved we were never gone. The celebration didn't last long. Because she knew, this was not rest. This was permission, to fight louder, sharper, smarter. And then came the invitation. A national news show, Sunday panel, topic: economic recovery in distressed communities. She read the email twice. J.D. Vance was confirmed as a guest. She closed the laptop, let the thought sit. What did it mean to sit across from someone who had never seen you as an equal? What did it mean to do it live? But deep down, she already knew. This wasn't about him. It never had been. This was for the girls who watched from kitchen counters, homework half finished, waiting to see someone win without having to shout. So, she said yes. The morning of the show, she didn't wear armor. She wore memory. Red blazer, curls swept back, gold studs that caught the light just enough to say, "You're not ignoring this." When she walked into the studio, the producer's clipboard trembled. The host stood up straighter. J.D. Vance looked up, then down, then back again. She took her seat, crossed one ankle over the other, and waited. The host began with pleasantries. Jargon, graphs. J.D. Vance spoke first. Of course he did. He leaned forward like his words had weight by default. Cited statistics with the ease of someone who had never had to wonder if they applied to him. And then, he said it. 4 words. Almost a whisper. "You're just being ghetto." It wasn't a shout. It was a knife so quiet it took a second to realize you were bleeding. The room went still. The host froze. The CEO swallowed. Even the control room stilled, as if air itself had paused to listen. Jasmine sat silent for a breath longer than protocol allowed. Then another. And another. She didn't look at him. She looked into the camera. Into the country. Into the couches and classrooms and hair salons and churches where women like her had been watching for centuries. Waiting for someone not to break down, but to build back. "I'm not surprised," she said, voice calm. "Because when black women speak clearly, we're told we're emotional. When we refuse to soften, we're labeled difficult. When we insist, we're called ghetto." She paused. The silence trembled. "You said it to diminish me," she continued. "But here's what I hear. I hear South Dallas. I hear my mother boiling rice at 11 p.m. after her second shift. I hear Sunday cookouts that fed whole neighborhoods. I hear power. I hear pride." She adjusted her mic. "You call it ghetto. I call it home." The host tried to move on. He mumbled something about student loans. J.D. said nothing. The show continued. But the moment had already detonated. And Jasmine hadn't yelled. She hadn't stormed. She had sat still and let the weight of truth land like thunder dressed as a whisper. The clip hit Twitter in under 10 minutes. Then TikTok. Then everywhere. Civil rights leaders called her measured. Political commentators called her brilliant. Black women called her seen. Some watched the clip 10 times. Others played it for their daughters. One principal added it to the school announcements under the heading, "Truth doesn't shout. It lands." And not everyone loved it. Conservative anchors played it over moody piano music and called it a tantrum. Others edited out J.D.'s insult and painted Jasmine as the aggressor. But it didn't matter. The people knew. The people saw, not just her words, but her poise, her precision, her refusal to be less than whole. Jasmine didn't release a statement, didn't post a tweet. She just sat in the backseat of a rideshare, phone buzzing with messages that she didn't answer yet. One, though, made her stop. A direct message, from a middle school teacher in Michigan. We played the clip in civics class today. One of my students, 12 years old, said, "I didn't know you could speak like that and still win." Jasmine stared at the words, and felt something shift, because it had never been about winning a moment. It had always been about rewriting the rules. And someone's daughter had already picked up the pen. She didn't announce her return. There was no press release, no teaser, no cryptic social media countdown. Just an email from the producers, polite but loaded. "We'd love to have you back." Same network, same table, same format, and, yes, same co-panelist. She stared at the invitation for nearly a minute. The screen glowed against her face like it was asking more than it said. They wanted a rematch. They wanted a headline. They wanted fireworks. But she wasn't here for that. Not this time. Not ever, really. She said yes, then said nothing. No tweet, no wink, no build-up. Because silence, when chosen, carries a heavier weight than noise. The morning of the taping, she didn't wake up different. She still checked the mirror for lint on her collar. Still whispered a few lines of scripture under her breath, not because she needed courage, but because it anchored her. Burnt orange blazer, simple earrings, no script in her hand. She walked into the studio like a question already answered. And when she sat, her presence alone rearranged the room. The cameras tracked her quietly. The host greeted her like she was royalty he couldn't quite touch. J.D. Vance was already seated. He glanced up when she entered, a flicker of something between regret and recognition passing through his eyes. She nodded once. Nothing more. This time, the topic was housing disparities. Affordable housing, zoning laws, evictions, a subject Jasmine knew intimately, not from textbooks but from courtrooms. From waiting rooms filled with mothers juggling toddlers and pink eviction slips. From neighbors who shared laundry machines and trauma in equal measure. J.D. spoke first again. Polished, controlled. He talked about market-driven solutions. About deregulation. About letting the free market self-correct. He gestured with his pen. Smiled faintly like a man who believed the sound of his own certainty was enough to win every argument. Jasmine listened. Still. Composed. She didn't interject. She waited. Not for her turn, but for the moment. And it came. J.D. leaned forward. "Look," he said, "I'm sure your community cares deeply. But turning this into an emotional issue doesn't help. We need logic here, not sentiment." The host flinched. The air shifted. Again. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink, didn't shift in her chair. She simply breathed, then spoke. "You think it's emotional," she said, voice steady, "because you've never had to choose between rent and dinner." She let that breathe. "You talk about zoning laws. I talk about mothers walking 2 miles to a boarded-up pharmacy. You talk about market trends. I talk about school kids living 3 to a room because their parents missed a payment." J.D. looked down, then up, but the room was no longer his. "You call it emotional," Jasmine continued. "I call it lived." The host said nothing. The teleprompter advanced, ignored, and that was the moment. Not because she had won, but because there was nothing left to say. J.D. didn't reply, couldn't, because anything he said now would sound hollow. After the segment, no one clapped. No one needed to. The quiet was applause. In the hallway, someone from the network staff whispered, "She redefined the whole fight." Jasmine walked out the same way she came in. Firm, clear. Present, not chasing anything, not running from anything, just existing, fully and without apology. She didn't celebrate, didn't replay the moment, didn't scroll the reactions. She went back to her office, took off her heels, sat behind her desk. The hum of the fluorescent light above was the only sound. And then her phone lit up. Just one text, from a father in Missouri. "Hi, My daughter's 12. We were watching the panel today. When it ended, she looked at me and said, I want to speak like her. Firm, calm, clear. Thank you for showing her what that looks like. Jasmine stared at the message and let it settle, because that was the why. Not the clip, not the echo, not the trend. The girl, 12, watching, learning, believing. And Jasmine, she remembered what it was to be that girl. To sit in classrooms where her questions made teachers uncomfortable. To be told her tone was too much, her ideas too loud, her voice too different. To feel her brilliance fold inward just to fit. She had built her voice out of all those moments. Out of schoolyard slights and courtroom interruptions. Out of microaggressions disguised as advice. Out of stares that lingered too long on her hair, her skin, her silence. She'd taken all of it and used it as blueprint, so someone else wouldn't have to start from zero. She turned off the phone, not because she was done, but because the world would still be here tomorrow. Still turning, still testing, still watching, and she needed to rest. Because this fight, it was never just about winning. It was about surviving with your voice intact, and passing it on before it broke. She visited a high school the next week. A multi-purpose room, fluorescent lights, rows of metal chairs, nothing glamorous. 30 teenage girls in gym uniforms and chipped nail polish. Some leaned back, arms crossed. Others leaned forward, trying not to look too interested. Jasmine didn't bring a speech. She brought her story, talked about her mom, about the teacher who called her ghetto fabulous, about debate club, about that panel. She kept it raw, because they deserved that. When she finished, silence hovered. Then one girl raised her hand. Thick braids, a hoodie tied around her waist. Why didn't you cuss him out? She asked. Like, for real. A few girls laughed. One muttered, same. Jasmine smiled, stepped down from the little stage. Stood eye level with them. Because I wasn't talking to him, she said. I was talking to you. Silence. Heavy. Meaningful. He wanted a show, she continued. He wanted me to get loud, so they could make the story about my volume, not my words. She looked around, met their eyes. All I gave them was truth. And they couldn't edit that out. She paused. So next time someone talks over you, talks down to you, makes you feel small, remember this. You don't have to match their fire. Just own your voice. Another pause. Calm, firm, clear, and let them choke on how composed you are. The girls didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They heard her, and that was enough. Afterward, one girl waited by the door. Didn't ask for a selfie. Didn't say much. Just handed Jasmine a notebook. I used to write, she said. But I stopped. My teacher said it sounded too ghetto. Jasmine opened the notebook. Read. The poems weren't polished. They were alive, sharp, beautiful, real. She handed it back. If that's what ghetto sounds like, she said softly, the world better listen up. The girl nodded, and walked away a little taller. The room was quiet, not the kind of quiet that asked for reverence. The kind that simply was. Jasmine sat alone in her office, the city humming just outside the windows, lights flickering in 1,000 windows like unsent messages. Her phone was face down. The inbox unread, no alerts, no applause, just stillness. She liked it that way. No speeches left to give. No clips left to go viral. No headlines waiting to spin her name into something it wasn't. She turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark. Not because she was tired, but because silence was honest. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't have to prove anything to anyone, not even herself. She thought about all the rooms she had walked into where she wasn't supposed to belong. The ones where she'd been spoken over. The ones where she was the only one who looked like her. Sounded like her. Asked the questions that made everyone else shift in their chairs. And how she'd stayed. Stayed when it would have been easier to walk out. Stayed when they wanted her smaller, softer, quieter. She hadn't. She had stayed, and in staying, she had made space, not just for herself but for others. Her mind drifted back to the girl in the hoodie, the one who asked why she hadn't cussed him out. Because I wasn't talking to him, Jasmine had said. I was talking to you. It echoed now, not as a line, not as a memory, but as a mission. Because that had been the truth all along. She wasn't fighting J.D. Vance. She wasn't fighting panels or policies or press narratives. She was speaking to the ones who'd been told to smile while being dismissed. To the ones who learned how to make their tone palatable before they learned how to diagram a sentence. To the ones who'd been labeled too much before they ever got a chance to be whole. She stood and walked to the window. The city was bathed in amber and soft neon. Cars like fireflies. People moving between their own versions of victory and survival. She could feel them. Somewhere, right now, a girl was being called ghetto in a classroom for asking a question too boldly. Somewhere else, a woman was being talked over in a board meeting for stating a fact too directly. And somewhere, maybe in a hallway, maybe in a mirror, someone was remembering what it felt like to shrink just enough to be accepted. Jasmine closed her eyes and let the weight of all of it settle across her shoulders. It didn't crush her, it clarified her. This had never been about revenge. It wasn't even about redemption. It was about resonance. About what happens when you hold your ground so fiercely that others begin to believe the ground is theirs too. The next morning, she returned to that same school gym in Tulsa. Same lights, same chairs, same girls. They greeted her with side eyes and shrugs and smirks they hadn't earned yet. She smiled anyway. She sat on the edge of the same makeshift stage. No notes, no outline, just a memory. She told them about the notebook. The poems. The girl who was told her words were too ghetto. She told them what she said. If that's what ghetto sounds like, the world better listen up. The girls didn't laugh. They didn't interrupt. They leaned in. Jasmine looked out across the room, at all those futures pretending to be just teenage faces, and said, "They'll call you things to make you doubt your voice. They'll call you loud when you're right, angry when you're clear, aggressive when you're certain." She paused. "But if you listen close, you'll hear what they're really saying." Another pause. "They're afraid of your power." One of the girls whispered, "That's real." Jasmine nodded. "It is." She stepped off the stage, walked through the crowd. No microphone, no lights, just her voice. You don't have to yell to be heard. You don't have to fight to be fierce. You don't have to match their tone. You just have to mean yours. When the session ended, most of the girls shuffled out. But a few stayed. One of them held up her phone. "Can I record you saying that last part again?" she asked. Jasmine chuckled. "You don't need me to say it again," she said. "You just need to say it next." She walked to her car in silence. The gym faded behind her. The day was warm, not hot, not heavy, just full. She sat in the driver's seat, the same old car with the faded campaign sticker still clinging to the back window. She closed the door, rested her hands on the steering wheel, and exhaled, not because she was finished, but because she had finally stopped holding her breath. Her phone buzzed once, a text from a colleague. "Congress is circling. There's talk." She smiled faintly, not because of ambition, but because she knew that whatever came next, whatever room, whatever table, whatever debate, they wouldn't meet the same Jasmine who had once sat frozen under studio lights. They'd meet a woman who had stopped waiting to be invited, and started building the room herself. The screen on her phone went dark. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need it, because somewhere, right now, another girl was writing. A poem, a speech, a story, in her own words, in her own voice. No permission asked, no label accepted, just truth. And that sound, that unfiltered, undeniable, ghetto-born truth, that was the sound of change. That was the sound of Jasmine Crockett. And this time, the world was listening.